Hey guys, before this video begins, I did want to give a quick trigger warning. In the first story, there are mentions of self-harm, and the second story, there are mentions of murder, so please stay safe while you listen, and I hope you enjoy these stories. If you've ever experienced a near-death experience, I'm sorry. I don't think there is any hope for us. The first time I was made aware of my predicament was after finishing my exams. It was a late, cold December night, and I was desperate to just get home as quickly as possible. Beyond the blistering cold, I was exhausted from the days of cramming I did in order to prepare for the final. Not that it did much good. I was fairly certain that I'd absolutely bombed the fluid mechanics portion. What little brain power I had left was wasted on calculating how big of a curve I would need in order to pass the class, so I was mainly traversing back on autopilot. At one point, my subconscious mind became aware of a faint neon orange hand, and I made a stop on the crosswalk. I convinced myself it was pointless to think about the exam any longer and let out a shallow sigh as my mind then wondered how my schedule would look like if I had to retake the course. The crosswalk signal changed to usher me forward. I had only taken a few steps when something broke me out of my trance. All I could feel was a rapid rising sense of unease, and I turned my head in search of the source. My eyes were met with a blindingly bright light. For a few moments, it seemed like everything was frozen in place. I had a brief thought about how odd it was humans have a shared experience of time slowing down when they're near death. I then wondered how I knew that I was about to die. After all, my sleep-addled brain still couldn't make out what exactly I was looking at. Maybe this was the light at the end of the tunnel everyone spoke of, I thought. As the light inched closer, my final thought was accepting that this was going to be my fate. And yet, at the last possible moment, the car managed to veer to the left. The sound of screeching tires fading away was what finally made me aware that I was still alive. My heart was beating at a rapid pace, and I could feel my blood loudly thrashing in my ears. My mind was racing, but I couldn't seem to be thinking of anything as I made it back to my house. I made it to my room before I realized that I was still shaking. The adrenaline was fading, and I had barely managed to collapse onto my bed before the thoughts came flooding through. I was nearly killed. It was maybe a foot or two that separated me and certain death. Would I really have been okay had I died today? Would I be able to say that I had no regrets? I quickly came up with a resounding no. There was so much that I wanted to do, so many things to try and experience. I got up to my desk and booted up my computer. I couldn't go to sleep after nearly just dying anyway. There, I planned out what I wanted to do, what I needed to do. No longer would I be content with my milquetoast lifestyle. I swore upon myself that from that day forth, memento mori would be engraved upon my very being. If any day could very well be my last, I was sure as hell going to live more like it. How ironic would things turn out knowing what I do now? How tragic. If there is any respite to be had, it would be those few months of blissful ignorance were probably the most that I'd ever lived in my entire life. Perhaps if I wasn't so curious, or maybe if things had just been a little different, I could have been able to enjoy it for a tiny bit more. I wish from the bottom of my heart that it could have lasted just a bit longer. Those few months went just about how you would expect it to. I was reinvigorated. I was filled to the brim with the kind of energy that only those who have been confronted with their mortality have tasted. No longer was failure a fear that shackled my decisions. I would embark on novel experiences and projects. Successes and failures both followed, but I only felt jubilation. Failures only served to spur me forward, while successes pushed me towards different ventures. I was riding the high of my mania. As Kumis put it, one should live to the point of tears, and I made sure to do so. I was much more outgoing than I had been in the past. New connections formed, and I found myself a part of different groups, each with their own way of seeking to get the most out of life. 2 of these groups would send me down the path I find myself ensnared in now. The first group was your typical thrill-seeking type of people. I really enjoyed my time with them. They lived life on the edge, and they slowly turned me into an adrenaline junkie like them. They eased me into it with roller coasters. They soon evolved into downhill skiing, which migrated to cliff jumping and finally skydiving. I can remember going into the airplane without a shred of anxiety. If anything, I was restless with anticipation. I couldn't wait to take the leap and add another experience under my belt. Eventually, the plane made it to altitude over the jump site, and one by one my friends made their way out of the airplane. I was fourth in line and was jumping tandem with an instructor. We made it out just fine and began our rapid descent towards the ground. It was exhilarating feeling the wind billowing around me from every direction, and once we were in the air, it felt like I was flying. I was still taking in everything when I noticed that the jumpers that were in front of me had already deployed their parachutes and were now at a higher altitude than us. I tried to turn my head towards the instructor, but wasn't able to see him completely. Regardless, I knew something was wrong. We were getting uncomfortably close to the ground with no signs of slowing down. Finally, I felt something come loose, and looking up to see the parachute deploy, with my hopes dashed immediately as the entire parachute had been cut away from the backpack. I reckoned we couldn't be more than 1,000 feet away from the ground, and still we were falling fast. Seconds went by, and again I had the thought of acceptance of my fate. I closed my eyes and braced myself, and best I could when I felt a yank on my shoulders. The instructor managed to get the reserve parachute open. We managed to survive despite the rough landing, but it was cutting it extremely close. I thought I'd simply gotten lucky again. I didn't learn my lesson that day. The second group were psychonauts. They experimented with psychedelics, and soon I dabbled with them. By this point, there was no need for them to ease me in. I was ready to dive in the deep end with them without hesitation. Foolish words, I know, but at the time I was brimming over with confidence and thought I could handle anything. Acid was a mainstay, as were magic mushrooms. Sometimes we would branch out, but we were loath to do any reagent testing, so we stuck with old reliables. One day, one of us received a batch of MDMA for cheap, and the entire group was eager to try it out. She had always come through with great quality stuff. We all took what should have been a normal dose and had a little kickback. How tragically stupid we were not to test it to make sure that it was pure. The batch was tainted with fentanyl, and most of us overdosed. 4 people died that day. I managed to get the only dud. Once was luck, twice was a coincidence, but 3 times? 3 brushes with death and surviving each time miraculously was something that I couldn't believe was just happenstance. Perhaps it was my curiosity, or maybe it was survivor's guilt, but I was determined to get to the bottom of this. I had some trepidation, but I knew there was no other option but to test it. Once again, I would dive into the deep end, spurred on by some feeling of invincibility. The revolver sat in my hand. I diligently loaded 1 bullet into the chamber and spun the barrel. I gently placed the barrel to the roof of my mouth, and click. I placed the gun back down, and for a second wondered if I've truly lost it. I repeated that every day for a week. At the end of the week, I tested the bullet, and sure enough, it fired into the dirt without a hitch. I kept up this routine for the entire month and made it through unscathed. I didn't want to face the forlorn conclusion that had sprouted from the back of my mind. I decided to go all in and play Russian roulette with a Glock. Again, no dice. If a bullet won't fire, then a rope would do the job just as well, right? Of course not. It proved just as futile as the guns did. 3 separate times I would try to hang myself, and 3 separate ropes would snap or rip conventionally. At my wit's end, I climbed to the tallest skyscraper in my city and prepared to jump. I glanced down, certain that there would be no possible way of surviving this fall. I steeled myself and jumped. Wouldn't you know it, a gust of wind blew me back through a window 1 floor down. I couldn't believe what had just happened. Lying there on the floor, all I could do was just let out a pained chuckle. I was now faced with the reality that I couldn't die. See, I told you it was ironic. From having your entire identity being based upon a saying meaning, remember you have to die, to realizing you might be immortal. Isn't that hilarious? From then I tried to understand why I couldn't die. I spent a few years chasing possible leads. I tried any and all possibilities ranging from spirituality to scientific. All that led me to running hypothesis. I am quantumly immortal. It's a bit of a complicated topic, but in a gist, every single instance where there is a possibility that I die, the universe splits into two versions. There's one version where I die, and my consciousness ceases to exist, and there is the other where I continue to be conscious observer. It's a flip coin every time to decide which one I am. Somehow, I am always sent into the universe where I am alive and still observing. If this hypothesis ends up being true, however, then it isn't only constrained to me. Every person out there is a possible observer. It could be you, and you'd have no way of knowing unless, like me, you've had some brushes with death. The only other alternative I could come up with is there is a cruel, cruel God, and they enjoy my suffering. For my sake, I hope it is merely a cruel God, because that means one day he might get bored and end this hellish torment. For your sake, I too hope this cruel God only has his sights set on me. To date, I've tried to kill myself 255 times. 255 times have I flipped the coin, and 255 times have it landed on heads. I want you to understand the sheer improbability of such a thing happening. It's about 1 in 5.39 to the 10th power of 67. It really is a mind-boggling number. I take mental damage just trying to perceive it. A guy called Scott Shippiel ran some similar numbers, and he put it into perspective. Deal yourself 5 cards once every billion years, and then buy yourself a lottery ticket every time you get a royal flush. If that ticket wins the jackpot, throw a grain of sand into the Grand Canyon. Now start over until you fill up the Grand Canyon. Once you've done that 1,000,000 times, the amount of time that has passed hasn't even reached 0.0001% of 5.39 to the 10th power of 67 seconds. And this was just the times that I purposely sought out death. There would be countless times that I was near death and yet still avoided it. Thus, I'm entirely certain I'm immortal. You might be wondering what's so dreadful about my predicament at this point. Perhaps this is more of a blessing than a curse, but unfortunately, I cannot see it that way. Ever since I had an inkling of my predicament, I've tried to ignore the nightmare's crux of my predicament. What kind of fate must I endure if I am to live forever? Already, I've had people that I care about die. That is simply the fate of all that live. And yet I am now removed from that cycle. Will I be forced to see that all I care about die, leaving me behind? What of my own body? My consciousness will survive, but what use will it be if it is trapped within an immobile prison? I'm certain that I will bear witness to many atrocities and tragedies in the near infinite future of mine. It is the primordial fear of the unknown that strikes me most to the core. All I know is that I will undoubtedly suffer, because I know that there is no end. However, what is worse is not knowing what fates await me in this eternity. Currently, I am barely afloat in an ocean. I can feel myself sinking, and I know that it won't be long before I succumb. I look around and know that there is nowhere to save me, nowhere I can swim to. I can only go down. Whenever I fall beneath the surface, I can only see the depths of the abyss. It seems impossible to even imagine there being a bottom to it, let alone what might be awaiting for me there. My only solace and the only reason I still continue with these attempts is that I'm giving another version of me the escape that he so desperately desires. For the versions of me that are lucky enough to have the coin land on tails, I envy you. There is no hope for me. I am to be the consciousness that is forever denied the embrace of death. Even still, I continue. Perhaps in a small part of me still believes that there's a chance that I will succeed, or it is simply the spite, the absurd fate that I find myself in. Attempt number 256. I inject the potassium chloride into my veins. In my head, I envious myself rolling a boulder to the top of the hill. I passed out and awaken hours later. I close my eyes and see the boulder come crashing down the other side, but I will continue trying for as long as I'm able. One must imagine Sisyphus is happy. My elf on the shelf murdered my children. I was a single father to 2 boys who I loved dearly. The other day, my 2 boys asked me if I could make their beloved elf on the shelf arrive a little bit early. I'd always brought it out on December 1st, so I told them no initially, but after hours of relentless pleading and begging, I finally gave in. I wish I hadn't. Okay, fine, I yelled at my 2 boys. Go to your rooms and I'll summon him here, I demanded. I watched them form a huge grin and then silently run up the stairs to their rooms. I sighed and started towards my bedroom where I'd hidden the elf in the shelf when it wasn't Christmas time. I looked through each one of my drawers each year. When Christmas rolled around, I always ended up forgetting where I had hid it the previous year. I always promised myself that next time I would write down where I hid it, but I never did. I opened my bottom drawer and felt the familiar shape of our elf that we've had for 8 Christmases now. I let out a sigh of relief and started to go to the living room with the elf. I set our elf on the top of the fireplace. I took a few steps back and admired how he looked sitting there. It gave me nostalgia for when I was a kid during Christmas time. I smiled from satisfaction and started up the stairs. I turned to my kids' rooms and they were both sound asleep. I looked forward to seeing their excitement tomorrow morning when they saw that the elf had come early. I walked in their room and kissed them both goodnight. I went into my own room and fell asleep. I awoke to a loud scream from both of my children coming from downstairs. I immediately got out of bed and ran down the stairs. I expected them to be excited about the elf, but this scream was full of fear. Something was wrong. When I was halfway down the stairs, the living room came into view. I was shocked and confused at the scene being presented to me. The entire room was filled with flour. I looked around the room and saw the elf sitting on a miniature chair that I didn't recognize, sitting right in the middle of the living room. What the fuck? I accidentally said out loud. What the frick? I corrected myself after realizing that my children were there. They gave me a concerned look because I never swore in front of them, but they moved on quickly and focused their attention on the living room again. My first thought was that my kids did this as a prank, but we didn't even have access to this much flour in the house. Every single thing in the room was covered in flour. I stepped into the living room and felt that there was about 6 inches of flour just on the floor. What do you boys know about this? I asked furiously. I thought that they surely had to know something. They both shrugged and said they truly didn't know. I could always sense whether they were telling the truth or not. I could tell that they were both being completely honest. My mind switched to the elf. Could he have... No, what am I thinking? Santa isn't real, but who or what else could have done this? I stood there in confusion, battling my thoughts for quite a while. There was nothing else that could have been responsible for this other than the elf. I simply couldn't believe it. I knew Santa wasn't real, and I knew that if he was somehow real, the elf certainly wouldn't be doing this. My mind switched back to the possibility that this had to be a prank of some sort. I didn't believe in the supernatural at all. Go up to your rooms, Al yelled at my 2 boys. They whined, but ultimately obeyed and started up the stairs. I took slow steps toward the elf until I was directly in front of him. I stared down at him sternly for a few seconds, when suddenly the flowers started to lift up into the air and swirl around me. I started to cough and had to close my eyes when I felt the flour getting in them. After 30 seconds, I opened my eyes and the flour was all gone from the room. and so was the elf. I put my hand to my face and saw that there was still flour on my face, though. I started to doubt my own mind. What just happened seemed like something that could only happen in someone's hallucinations. I decided to call my kids downstairs to confirm that I was not delusional. "Boys, come down here," I yelled. I heard their door open and then their tiny footsteps rushed down the stairs. "Wow, Dad, how'd you clean it up that fast?" my eldest yelled. My stomach sank when he asked the question. It confirmed that what I had experienced was reality. I don't know," I replied while staring at the floor with concern and confusion. It was the single most supernatural thing that I experienced in my lifetime. I suddenly knew that I needed to look for the elf. I searched my entire house upside down, but he was nowhere to be found. After I checked the last possible nook and cranny that I could think of, I collapsed on the floor, covered in sweat. I had searched the house for hours and still didn't find him. I needed something to eat. I got up and started towards the kitchen. I felt a wave of guilt wash over me when I realized I had forgotten to feed my children breakfast. I opened the fridge and started cooking their favorite breakfast to make up for it. The cooking helped me focus on something else other than my surreal flour experience. I finished cooking breakfast and plated my boys' meals. I made sure they each had an exactly equal amount of everything so that they wouldn't fight. "Kids, breakfast." My kids ran down the stairs. "Finally," my youngest said in an annoyed tone just before rolling his eyes. "I'm sorry, but I made your favorite," I replied. "Thanks," he replied and then picked up his fork. "Dad!" I heard my oldest yell. My eyes were horrified when they looked at the scene on his plate. The elf was sitting on his plate in a miniature chair holding a candy cane, a sharpened candy cane. A sharpened candy cane that had blood on it. I got up and swiftly made it to his plate. I snatched the elf in my hands and squinted at it. My skin began to crawl when I felt movement in my hand that wasn't from me. It was from the elf. He pierced my hand with the candy cane and I threw it across the room and looked at my hand. The cut began to ooze out blood. "What the hell?" I screeched. The toy elf had just assaulted me. I looked in the direction where I threw the elf and noticed that it was gone. That realization made my stomach drop to the floor. I now felt absolutely terrified and unsafe in my own home. "Follow me," I ordered my kids just before I started to walk up the stairs. I was moving my entire family to my bedroom. I felt like the best option at the time. I didn't know what that elf was capable of, and it seemed like a good idea to have my sons, who I loved dearly, right next to me at all times. I opened my bedroom door and watched my two boys enter. Their faces were full of fear. It hurt me to see that. Once they had both entered, I closed and locked my door. I had to make sure that that room was safe. I started to search my entire room. Every single place that I could think of, I searched. Once I was done, I searched the entire room a second time. I saw no sign of that elf. The fact didn't ease my anxiety, though. He disappeared earlier and had somehow suddenly come back. I had the master bedroom, and it contained a bathroom. I also had a mini fridge with food and water. I knew that we could survive there a couple of days if it came to it. I had not checked the time once all day, and I felt it was finally time to do so. I pulled my cellular device out of my pocket and saw it was now 4 hours since I had woken up. I felt my stomach growl with hunger and realized that my children were still hungry. They didn't have a chance to eat that breakfast that I prepared. I opened my mini fridge and was relieved when I saw it was fully stocked. I had restocked it the night before the last. I had 10 water bottles, 5 of each, various fruits, and some Lunchables. I grabbed 2 Lunchables and 2 apples and handed them to my kids. They instantly started to open the packages and ate their food within 10 minutes. They put the apple to the side as I expected they would. My children hated fruits. It was always a struggle to get them to eat it, but that was the least of my concern at the moment. I sat down on the bed and sighed. I started to shake with anxiety and wanted everything to go back to normal so bad. The elf that I had watched my children grow up with over the Christmas season had now turned into a monster. "Dad, what's going on with the elf? Did he turn evil?" my youngest asked me in a calm and curious tone. I sighed and began to rub my forehead. I think so, I replied sadly. Why did he hurt you? I thought elves were supposed to be good, my son asked, now sounding upset. I thought so as well, I replied, tears starting to form in my eyes. He began to burst out in tears. So did I. I pulled him in for a hug and tried to comfort him. I felt so genuinely bad for this kid. I heard a stabbing noise come from the right of me, followed by a scream coming from my oldest. I snapped out of my crying episode and felt pure rage take over me when I saw what had happened. I watched my child struggle on the ground as the elf repeatedly stabbed my son with a large ceramic knife that had a Christmas pattern on it. I watched my child start to choke on blood with each stab. I saw pure agony in his eyes. I let out a wild scream and charged towards the elf. I tried to stop it, but the elf instantly teleported in front of me and stabbed me right in the stomach. He then teleported right back to my son and continued to brutally stab him. I put my hand to my stomach and brought my hand to view and saw the large amount of blood. I struggled to breathe and I started to feel lightheaded. I pulled my cellular device out of my pocket and shakingly entered my passcode. The phone was knocked out of my hand and thrown across the room, extremely forcefully, causing it to go through the wall. I looked down at the floor and saw the trail of blood that I had left. The scene was sickening and anxiety-inducing. I could feel the blood drain from my body and became terrified at the thought of my own death. I knew that I had to fight. I couldn't just let myself die when my son was being murdered. I turned around and felt a wave of intense nausea wash over me as I saw just how mutilated my son's body had become from the stabbing. His entire body, head to toe, was covered with blood and brutal stab wounds. I came to the horrifying realization that he was certainly dead. No one could survive that brutal stabbing. I became impossibly more sick when I saw the elf begin to stab my youngest son repeatedly the same way he did to my oldest. I didn't know what to do. If I attempted to stop him, I would more likely get stabbed again. I came to a realization that I was most likely the next and final one to endure the brutal stabbing after my son. I lost all hope. I truly believed that there was nothing I could do to help. Suddenly an idea came into mind. I remember all the elf stories I had read as a child and remembered their one weakness: iron. It would explain why the elf was using a ceramic knife. My face lit up with hope when I also remembered the fact that I kept the pocket knife handy under my bed. I rushed to my bed and crouched. I quickly grabbed the knife and flipped it open. I saw the scene again and became even more sick when I saw that my youngest son was now certainly dead as well. I watched the elf look at my knife I carried and then instantly stopped. I could sense that he was about to try and escape, so I quickly aimed for the elf and threw the knife at it. I watched in slow motion as the knife soared through the air towards the elf. I was so terrified that it would miss the elf and my plan would fail, but I smiled and cheered as I watched the knife slam into the elf. The elf instantly went still and limp. It had lost all its magic and now was simply a toy, like it should have been the whole time. My smile quickly faded when I realized that the reality was that my two sons had just been murdered in front of me, and that I watched it all. I needed to get out of the house and find help. I looked down and felt more lightheaded when I saw the pool of blood that my wound had caused. I opened my bedroom door and staggered down the stairs while pressing my wound. I breathed heavily each step I took. I need to come up with a lie as to how my sons were murdered. No one would have believed they were killed by an evil toy elf. I settled on a plan to just tell him a fully covered intruder broke in and committed the acts. I reached my front door and turned the handle. It felt surreal to see my neighborhood filled with peaceful life, what I had just gone through. A couple walking along the sidewalk just across my house noticed that I was bleeding. They ran over and asked me what was wrong. I struggled to speak, but I managed to ask them for their cellular device so I could dial 911. The boyfriend instantly grabbed it out of his pocket and handed it to me. I punched the emergency number and dialed it. I pressed the device to my ear. It rang a few seconds, and then a female operator picked up. I explained that an intruder broke in my house and murdered my children and stabbed me in the stomach in the process. The boyfriend took off my shirt and told me to sit down. He took off my shirt and applied pressure to the wound with his shirt. I waited there for minutes, but it felt like hours. I felt a wave of relief when I heard the police sirens start to come closer and closer until there were multiple cop cars and an ambulance in front of me. I was taken away by the ambulance. I woke up in the hospital sometime later. My mother and father were sitting in the chair in the corner. They gasped with relief and started to cry. My mother walked towards me and started to rub my head. I felt deeply saddened as I remembered doing the same to my late son not too long ago. I started to cry as well. I wanted my sons back. I wanted to enjoy a wonderful Christmas season with them, but any chance of that ever happening was all ripped away from me that day. My father came over and started to cry with us. My mother and father grabbed both of my hands. I'm so sorry that happened to you, my father spoke. I never really got to know my father because he was in the military most of my childhood. I am too, my mother spoke and then squeezed my hand. She leaned in and gave me a hug. I accepted it gracefully and my tears began to lessen. My father did the same just after my mother, and I accepted it as well. My mother then handed me my laptop. I thought you could use something to do here, she said. Thank you. I never really used my laptop much. I preferred to stay away from the screens and spend time outdoors, but it was a useful thing to have while I stayed in the hospital. A nurse opened the door. Unfortunately, visiting hours are over, she spoke. My mother looked at the nurse and then nodded. We love you so very much, and we are so sorry. We will see you tomorrow, my mother spoke as she and my father left the room. I opened my laptop and started writing this. I am so sad, heartbroken, and confused. I'm trying my best to deal with the traumatic incident. Night has now fallen, so I'm gonna get some rest. Hey guys, I wanted to thank you all for the support that I've been receiving on this channel, and I really wanted to thank all of the writers, despite it only being 2, for letting me narrate these stories, because I really truly did enjoy reading them. Now before this video ends, I do want to remind everyone that Thankmas is this month. If you don't know what Thankmas is, Thankmas was created by Jacksepticeye to raise money for charity. Last year he opened it up for creators to join to help raise money, as much money as we possibly could, and I did help out with it last year. I wanted to continue doing it this year. If you didn't know, Thankmas is on December 10th, and many creators, along with Jacksepticeye, will be streaming, uploading videos, all that. Even though it's on December 10th, we are already raising money. The charity that we're helping out this year for Thankmas is World Central Kitchen, which is a non-profit organization that is the first to the front lines providing fresh meals in response to crisis. We're partnered with World Central Kitchen this year to assist all their current work around the world. In just the past couple of months, World Central Kitchen has provided millions of meals in response to crisis around the globe, including Hurricane Ian in Florida and Fiona across the Caribbean, the war in Ukraine, and the flooding in Kentucky, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. A nourishing meal in a time of crisis is so much more than a plate of food. It's hope. It's dignity. It's a sign that someone cares about you, and that you are not alone. I know it's near the holidays, and not a lot of people have money, but anything helps, even just sharing the link. If you want to know more, or you want to donate, all the links that you need will be down below. And once again, I want to thank everyone for all the support I've been getting recently. I'll see you in the next video, and remember, stay safe.